A wealthy business owner wrongfully fires a black employee after getting her pregnant. Years later, their son gets hired at the wealthy man's company, and the man is shocked when he hears the black man's last name. Imani Rhodes stood in front of Marcus Sterling's desk, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The leather chair beneath her felt cold, like it wasn't meant for her. Marcus hadn't looked up from the papers he was reviewing. The soft scratching of his pen was the only sound in the room, and it was driving her nerves up even more. Finally, Marcus set his pen down and leaned back in his chair, looking at her with that same calculated expression she had seen so many times before. "Imani," he said, his voice calm but distant. "I assume this isn't about work." Imani's heart pounded in her chest. She had rehearsed this conversation in her head for days, but now, sitting here in front of him, her voice felt stuck in her throat. She swallowed hard and forced herself to speak. "No, it's not," she said softly, looking down at her hands. I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was suffocating. Marcus didn't move. He didn't react. It was like he hadn't heard her. The seconds stretched on, each one heavier than the last, until finally he spoke. "I see." That was it. Nothing else. Imani blinked, her heart still racing. "It's yours, Marcus," she added, trying to keep her voice steady. "I thought you should know." Marcus sighed, leaning forward in his chair, elbows on his desk as he steepled his fingers in front of him. "Imani," he began, his tone cool and measured. "This is unfortunate." "Unfortunate?" Her voice wavered, disbelief creeping in. She had expected shock, anger maybe. But this? This indifference? "Yes," Marcus said, looking her directly in the eyes now, his expression cold. "You should have been more careful." Her stomach twisted. We were careful." "Clearly not careful enough," he replied, his words cutting through her like ice. He leaned back again, eyes narrowing slightly. "And now you're telling me because you what? Expect me to do about it?" Imani's throat tightened. She hadn't thought this far ahead. She hadn't expected it to be like this. Hadn't thought he'd be so cold. "I thought you'd want to know," she said quietly. "I thought maybe we could figure something out." Marcus's face hardened. "Figure something out? Imani, you know how these things work. I'm married. I have a family, a reputation. This," he gestured between them, "was never supposed to be anything more than what it was." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had been a fool, she realized that now. Late nights in his office, whispered promises, stolen moments. She had let herself believe it was something real. But to him, it had always been something disposable. Imani sat up straighter, gathering the last of her courage. "I'm keeping the baby, Marcus." He sighed again, standing up from his desk and walking around to stand in front of her. "I can't be involved in this, Imani, you know that. This conversation, it never happened. Understand?" Her blood ran cold. "What? You're just walking away?" "I have to," he said, his voice firm but calm. "You should too." Imani stood up, anger starting to burn in her chest. "I can't just walk away from this, Marcus. It's your child too." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Imani, I'm warning you. Let this go. I've taken care of you. But if you make this a problem for me, I'll make sure you regret it." Her heart dropped. "What are you saying?" He didn't answer right away, simply returning to his desk. When he sat back down, his expression was icy. "I'm saying this is your last day at Sterling Associates." Imani froze. "What?" "You'll be discreetly let go. I've already spoken with HR." His tone was business, impersonal. "You'll get a severance package, of course, but after today you're no longer an employee here." The words hit her like a blow. "You're firing me because I'm pregnant. Because of you. I'm protecting my family, Imani, and you should protect yourself." He leaned forward slightly, his voice low and dangerous. "If you try to come after me, I'll make sure you never work in this industry again." Imani's hands shook, fury and disbelief warring inside her. She stood there, staring at the man she had once trusted, the man who now looked at her like a threat. She swallowed back the lump in her throat. "I never thought you'd do this." "You never should have thought anything else," Marcus replied, his voice calm as if this were just another business deal to him. Caleb's brow furrowed. What do you mean? It's Sterling Associates. It's one of the top insurance firms in the country. This could be huge for me, for us. I know, baby, she said, her voice even softer now. But that place. It's not what you think. He stared at her, confusion spreading across his face. What do you mean? Did you know someone who worked there? Is that why you're worried? Imani's hands tightened around the mug, and Caleb noticed how her knuckles whitened. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a second, he thought she might say something more. But instead, she just shook her head, her gaze still fixed on the tea. It's nothing like that. I just want you to be careful, that's all. Caleb leaned back in his chair, trying to make sense of her sudden change in mood. His mother had always been his biggest supporter, pushing him to aim high, telling him he could achieve anything if he worked hard enough. But now, when he was on the cusp of something great, she seemed to be holding back. Careful? He repeated, his tone edging toward frustration. Mom, this is what we've been working toward for years. I didn't go through all that school and those internships for nothing. This job could change everything for us. I know, she said, looking up at him finally, her eyes shadowed with something that looked like fear. But not everything is what it seems. Caleb frowned, leaning forward. What's going on, Mom? Why are you saying all this now? You were excited when I first told you about the job. Imani hesitated again, and Caleb felt the tension between them grow thicker. It was like there was something unsaid, something heavy hovering over their conversation. He couldn't understand what had changed. I just don't want you to get hurt, she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. Some places, they have shadows, Caleb, things you don't see until it's too late. Caleb's frown deepened. Shadows, Mom? It's a job, an opportunity. I'm not some kid walking into a trap. This is going to help us. It's going to help you. Imani's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she looked so much older than he'd ever seen her. Just be careful, Caleb. Promise me. He softened, seeing the weight of whatever she was carrying but not understanding why. I'll be careful, I promise. But you've got to trust me. I've worked hard for this, and I'm not going to let anything mess it up. She nodded, though the worry never left her face. I trust you, Caleb. I always have. He stood up, checking his watch. I've got to head out. I'll call you later, okay? Imani smiled, though it was thin, as though it cost her something. Good luck, baby. Caleb kissed her on the forehead before grabbing his briefcase and heading toward the door. But just before he stepped out, he glanced back at her. She was still sitting at the table, staring down into her tea, her face drawn and tense. For the first time, doubt flickered in his chest. But he shook it off. This was his moment, and nothing was going to stop him. The subway ride into Midtown felt like the beginning of something big. Caleb stood in the crowded car, gripping the pole, his thoughts racing. This was everything he had worked for, the first step toward a successful career, and he wasn't going to let his mom's strange warning get in his head. Sterling Associates was one of the biggest names in the industry. They didn't hire just anyone. He had beaten out hundreds of applicants to get here. If his mom was worried, it was probably just nerves. After all, this was a huge change, and maybe she was just scared of what it meant for their future. He'd talk to her about it later, when she wasn't so rattled. Stepping out of the subway station, Caleb paused at the foot of the Sterling Associates building. The glass tower loomed above him, sleek and imposing. The sunlight reflected off its mirrored surface, making it shimmer like something out of a dream. He took a deep breath and squared his shoulders. This is it, he thought. This is where everything starts. Inside, the lobby was grand, filled with the quiet buzz of professionals moving quickly to wherever they needed to be. Caleb checked in with the receptionist, and within minutes, he was being led upstairs by his supervisor, Miss Vaughn, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a quick pace. Welcome aboard, Caleb, she said as they stepped into the elevator. We're expecting a lot from you. Thank you, ma'am, Caleb replied, his nerves turning to excitement again. I'm ready to get started. Miss Vaughn gave him a brief nod. Good. Let's hope you live up to your potential. They walked through the office, a maze of cubicles and glass-walled meeting rooms. Everything looked pristine, high-tech. People were busy, focused on their work, barely glancing up as Caleb passed by. He could feel the intensity of the place, the pressure to perform. As they moved through the floor, Caleb spotted him, Marcus Sterling, the CEO himself, talking to a group of senior executives. Caleb couldn't help but feel a surge of admiration. This was the man who had built the company from the ground up, a man who embodied everything Caleb wanted to achieve. But as they passed, Marcus's gaze flickered toward him. Their eyes met just for a moment, and Caleb froze. Marcus's face didn't change, his expression still neutral, professional. But there was something in his eyes, a brief flicker of recognition, almost like a shadow passing over his features. Then it was gone. Marcus turned back to his conversation without another glance. Caleb shook off the strange feeling and continued walking. It was probably just his imagination. Marcus Sterling didn't know him, he was just another new hire. Still, something about the look stuck with him, lingering in the back of his mind as Miss Vaughn showed him to his desk and gave him his first assignments. As the day went on, Caleb focused on his work, the thrill of starting fresh pushing aside any lingering doubts. This was where he belonged, and he was going to prove himself. But even as he threw himself into his tasks, his mother's words echoed in his head. Some places have shadows, Caleb. Things you don't see until it's too late. He shook his head, trying to clear the thought. He wasn't in any danger. He was here to succeed. Whatever shadows his mother feared, they couldn't touch him. Not here, not now. The office had settled into a rhythm by mid-morning, a quiet hum of keyboards and murmured conversations filling the open space. Caleb sat at his new desk, his fingers flying across the keys as he familiarized himself with the workflow. His supervisor, Miss Vaughn, had given him a stack of documents to review, and while the work was straightforward, the weight of the environment pressed on him. Sterling Associates was a serious place, and everyone around him seemed laser-focused. But no matter how hard he tried to concentrate, his thoughts kept drifting back to that brief moment earlier in the hallway, Marcus Sterling's eyes locking with his for just a second. That flicker of recognition. Caleb frowned, flipping through the pages of the report in front of him. It didn't make sense. Marcus Sterling didn't know him, couldn't know him. He was just another new employee in a company of hundreds, maybe even thousands. Why would the CEO take notice of him? He pushed the thought aside. It was probably just nerves. First-day jitters. Caleb had always been prone to overthinking, especially when something big was at stake. He needed to focus, prove himself, show the higher-ups that he belonged here. Lunchtime came and went. Caleb ate quickly at his desk, not wanting to waste a single minute. He had heard that Sterling Associates was a cutthroat place, where people were judged by their productivity, and he wasn't about to fall behind. The reports he had been assigned were dense, but he plowed through them, determined to make a good impression. But as the afternoon wore on, that strange feeling from earlier kept creeping back. It wasn't just about the way Marcus Sterling had looked at him. There was something else, something lurking beneath the surface that he couldn't quite put his finger on. It wasn't until later, when Miss Vaughn came by to check on his progress, that the unease settled in again. "You're doing well, Caleb," she said, glancing over his shoulder at the screen. "Good pace." "Thank you," Caleb replied, leaning back slightly to stretch. "Just trying to keep up with everything." "You're handling it just fine. Keep it up." She started to walk away, but then paused and turned back, her face suddenly more serious. "Oh, and I almost forgot. Mr. Sterling wants to see you in his office now." Caleb blinked. "Mr. Sterling?" She didn't elaborate. "He's on the 40th floor. You can head up now." Miss Vaughn walked away without another word, leaving Caleb sitting at his desk, stunned. Why would Marcus Sterling want to see him? On his first day, no less. His heart began to pound as he stood up and straightened his jacket. This wasn't normal, was it? New hires didn't get summoned by the CEO out of nowhere. He glanced around at his colleagues, but no one else seemed to notice him as they went about their work. Caleb made his way to the elevator, his palms growing damp. He tried to steady his breathing. This could be good news, right? Maybe Marcus had been impressed by something in his resume, something that stood out. Maybe he wanted to personally welcome Caleb to the company. But even as he tried to calm himself, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered something darker. His mom's words from that morning echoed again. Some places have shadows. When the elevator doors opened on the 40th floor, Caleb was greeted by an entirely different atmosphere from the busy lower levels. The executive floor was quieter, more polished, with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the afternoon light. Everything about this place felt important, from the sleek furniture to the soft carpet underfoot. He approached the receptionist's desk, trying to ignore the knot tightening in his stomach. "I'm here to see Mr. Sterling, Caleb Rhodes." The receptionist, a woman with perfect posture and a warm smile, nodded and gestured to the large wooden doors behind her. "He's expecting you. Go right in." Caleb hesitated for a moment, his nerves now in full swing. Then, taking a deep breath, he pushed open the doors and stepped into Marcus Sterling's office. The room was massive, with a panoramic view of the city skyline that made Caleb feel even smaller than he already did. Marcus sat behind a large mahogany desk, his back to the window, glancing over some papers. He didn't look up immediately, and for a brief moment, Caleb stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Finally, Marcus looked up, his face expressionless. "Caleb, come in. Have a seat." Caleb crossed the room and sat down in the leather chair opposite the desk, his heart still racing. Marcus Sterling's presence was intimidating, even more so in the quiet of his office. "So," Marcus began, his voice calm but measured. "How's your first day going?" Caleb swallowed, trying to keep his voice steady. "Good, sir. I've been working through the reports Miss Vaughn gave me. Everything's going well so far." Marcus nodded, setting the papers aside, his gaze sharpening slightly as he studied Caleb more closely now. "That's good to hear." For a moment, there was silence. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Caleb's. There was something strange in the way he was looking at him, like he was searching for something or trying to place him. Caleb felt the tension grow in the room. "Is there something specific you wanted to talk to me about, Mr. Sterling?" Marcus's expression didn't change. "You're new here, Caleb, just starting out, but your name caught my attention." Caleb's chest tightened. "My name?" "Yes." Marcus's eyes narrowed just for a fraction of a second before he leaned forward slightly. "Rhodes, isn't it?" Caleb nodded slowly, not sure where this was going. "Yes, sir. Caleb Rhodes." Marcus's gaze lingered on him for another moment. Then he sat back in his chair, his face unreadable. "It's a strong name. Reminds me of someone I used to know." Caleb's heart was thudding in his chest now. He could feel the weight of Marcus's words hanging in the air. Was it possible that Marcus knew? That somehow, in this brief conversation, he had figured out who Caleb really was? But Marcus didn't press further. Instead, he smiled faintly, a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I like to keep track of the new talent coming into the company. We expect great things from you, Caleb. Keep up the good work." Caleb forced a nod, unsure of what else to say. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." Marcus glanced down at the papers on his desk, signaling the end of the conversation. "Good. You can get back to it then." Caleb stood up, his legs feeling unsteady as he made his way toward the door. But just as he reached for the handle, Marcus's voice stopped him. "Oh, and Caleb?" Caleb turned, his hand still on the door. "If you ever need anything," Marcus said, his tone still calm but laced with something Caleb couldn't quite identify. "My door is always open." Caleb nodded again, swallowing hard. "I'll keep that in mind." With that, he stepped out of the office, his heart still racing in his chest. The door closed softly behind him, and Caleb stood in the quiet hallway, trying to process what had just happened. There was no reason for Marcus Sterling to take an interest in him. No reason for him to call Caleb into his office on his first day. And yet, something about the way Marcus had looked at him, the way he had mentioned his name, it felt like more than a coincidence. The elevator ride back down felt longer than it should have. As Caleb returned to his desk, the noise of the office washed over him, but it did little to calm the unease twisting in his gut. His mother had been right. There were shadows here, and Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing right in the middle of one. The key clicked into the lock as Caleb pushed open the door to the apartment. The familiar scent of home greeted him, Imani's cooking, the faint hint of lavender she always used to clean the place. The comfort of it was almost enough to shake off the strange tension that had followed him home after his first day at Sterling Associates. Almost. He set his briefcase down gently by the door, loosening his tie as he walked into the living room. Imani was there, sitting on the couch with a book open in her lap, though her eyes weren't on the page. She looked up when he entered, her expression unreadable. "How was it?" she asked, her voice calm, but with an edge of something Caleb couldn't quite place. Caleb hesitated. How was he supposed to describe his day, the excitement of starting a new chapter, the strange feeling of being watched, of being known? Marcus' sterling eyes, that flicker of recognition. It had been a whirlwind of confusion, excitement, and unease all wrapped together. "It was fine," Caleb said, trying to sound convincing as he sat down on the couch beside her. "Busy. They've got me working on a lot of reports. I'm trying to get a feel for the place." Imani nodded slowly, but her gaze lingered on him for a moment too long. She wasn't convinced. "Anything unusual happen?" Caleb paused, unsure of how much to share. "Not really," he began, but then stopped. There was no point hiding it. His mom already seemed on edge about the whole job. "Well, actually, I met Marcus Sterling today." Imani's hand tightened around the edge of her book. "You met him?" Caleb nodded. "Yeah, he called me up to his office. I have no idea why. It was weird. I mean, he's the CEO. Why would he care about some new hire?" Imani stayed silent, her eyes darkening as she looked away. Caleb noticed the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders stiffened at the mention of Marcus. She wasn't surprised. Not the way he thought she'd be. There was something else going on. He leaned forward, his voice softening. "Mom, what is it? Why are you acting like this?" Imani's breath caught in her throat. She set her book down on the coffee table, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them in her lap. "Caleb, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Caleb frowned, his stomach knotting. "What do you mean?" She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Marcus Sterling, he's not just your boss." Caleb's pulse quickened, a cold wave of confusion washing over him. What? What are you talking about?" Imani's eyes met his, filled with regret and pain. "He's your father, Caleb." For a second, the words didn't make sense. Caleb blinked, his mind struggling to process what she had just said. His father? Marcus Sterling? The Marcus Sterling? What? Caleb's voice came out in a whisper. "That can't be right." Imani nodded, her voice shaky but firm. "It's true. Marcus and we were involved a long time ago, before you were born." Caleb shook his head, disbelief crashing through him. "But you said my father left you. You never told me who he was." He stood up, running a hand through his hair as his mind raced. "How could you keep this from me? How could you not tell me?" Imani stood too, her hands wringing together. "I was trying to protect you, Caleb. I didn't want you to grow up knowing what kind of man he is." "What kind of man?" Caleb's voice rose, a mixture of anger and shock. "You didn't think I deserved to know? To know who my father is?" Tears welled up in Imani's eyes, but she didn't look away. "I didn't want you to be hurt, Marcus. He didn't want you. When I told him I was pregnant, he fired me. He cut me off from everything. And when I tried to find work elsewhere, he blacklisted me from the entire industry." Caleb froze, the weight of her words settling in. "He blacklisted you?" Imani nodded, wiping her eyes. "Yes. I couldn't get a job after that. I had no income, no support. It was just me and you, and I had to fight to make ends meet. He didn't care. He just wanted me out of his life, and he did everything he could to make sure I couldn't come back." Caleb's stomach turned. The man he had admired, the man he had just met in his office today, his father, had done this, had left his mother with nothing, had abandoned him before he was even born. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Caleb asked, his voice quieter now but still filled with hurt. "All these years I've wondered about him. I've asked you, but you never said anything. Why now?" Imani's face crumpled, and she sank back down onto the couch, her hands trembling. "I thought I could keep it buried. I didn't want you to ever know what kind of man he is. But when you told me you got a job at Sterling Associates, I couldn't keep it from you any longer. You deserve to know the truth, Caleb. I just didn't know how to tell you." Caleb stood there, staring at her, his chest tight with a mix of emotions, anger, confusion, sadness. All these years he had been kept in the dark, and now everything was unraveling in front of him. He felt a wave of nausea rise up. Marcus Sterling, his father, had known about him this whole time. And not only had he abandoned them, but he had also actively worked to destroy his mother's career. "I can't believe this," Caleb said, shaking his head. "I've been working for him, sitting in his office like I was just another employee. And all this time, he knew." "He doesn't know who you are," Imani said, her voice weak. "He didn't recognize you, Caleb. He doesn't know." "That's not the point." Caleb's voice cracked, anger surging inside him. "He abandoned us, Mom. He destroyed your life. And now I'm supposed to just sit there and work for him like nothing happened?" Imani looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "I didn't tell you this to make you hate him. I told you because I didn't want you walking into that place without knowing the truth. I didn't want you getting close to him, only to be hurt all over again." Caleb's chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath. Everything felt like it was spinning out of control. His whole life, he had imagined his father as a mystery, a man who had simply walked away. But the truth was so much worse. He paced the room, running his hands over his face. "I don't even know what to do now. Do I confront him? Do I quit?" Imani stood, placing a hand gently on his arm. "That's your choice, Caleb. But you need to think carefully. Marcus is powerful. He could ruin you, just like he ruined me." Caleb met her eyes, the anger still burning in his chest. "I'm not afraid of him. He can't hurt me like he hurt you." Imani sighed, her face filled with worry. "I just want you to be safe." Caleb stared at her, the weight of everything crashing down around him. He didn't know what his next move was. But one thing was clear. He couldn't keep working for Marcus Sterling like nothing had happened. The subway rumbled under Caleb's feet as he stared out the window, his reflection flickering in the dark tunnels. It had been 2 days since his mother had told him the truth. 2 days since everything he thought he knew about his life had been turned upside down. He still couldn't wrap his head around it. Marcus Sterling was his father. Caleb's fists clenched as the thought sank in deeper. Every time he replayed that conversation in his head, it only made him angrier. His father, the man he'd met on his first day at Sterling Associates, had looked at him like he's nothing more than another employee. The man who had ruined his mother's career blacklisted her and walked away without a second thought. And now Caleb was working under him, like nothing had happened. The subway screeched to a halt, and Caleb snapped out of his thoughts. He had to get himself together before he walked into the office. He couldn't let anyone see how close he was to the edge. Not yet. Not until he figured out what to do next. The cold morning air hit him as he stepped out of the station and onto the busy streets of Midtown. Sterling Associates loomed ahead, its sleek glass tower rising against the sky. It had once felt like a symbol of his success, a place where he could prove himself. Now it felt like a cage, trapping him in a twisted game he hadn't even known he was playing. The office was bustling as usual when Caleb walked in. Phones rang, voices hummed, and the steady rhythm of keyboards filled the air. No one paid him much attention as he made his way to his desk, which was just fine with him. He needed time to think. But the moment he sat down, the weight of everything crashed down on him again. He opened his laptop, the cursor blinking on the screen, but he couldn't focus. Every task felt meaningless in the shadow of what he now knew. How could he sit here and act like everything was normal? How could he work for a man who had walked away from his responsibility, who had abandoned him and his mother without a second thought? The worst part was that Marcus didn't even remember him. Caleb had seen it in his eyes that first day. The brief flicker of recognition quickly dismissed. To Marcus, he was just another employee, another face in the crowd. He glanced across the office to where Marcus's assistant sat outside his corner office. The door was closed, as it often was. But Caleb could picture him in there, sitting behind his desk, as calm and collected as ever, running a company, managing hundreds of employees, while the truth of his past remained buried. Not for much longer, Caleb thought grimly. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't just sit here knowing the truth and doing nothing. But what was he supposed to do? March into Marcus's office and tell him everything? Confront him in front of the whole company? He had thought about it, imagined it, over and over in his head. Marcus's shocked face, the truth spilling out like a flood. But then what? Marcus had power, influence. He could easily turn the situation against Caleb, just like he had with his mother. Caleb stared at his screen, the words of the report in front of him blurring together. He couldn't act recklessly. He needed to be smart about this. As the morning wore on, Caleb tried to push through the tension that knotted his shoulders, but every time he looked up from his work, the sight of Marcus's office made his skin crawl. The door remained closed. The man inside, completely unaware of the storm brewing just outside. Lunch came and went, though Caleb barely touched his food. His mind was too full, racing with thoughts of what to do next. He couldn't stay here, not working for Marcus. But he couldn't just quit, either. Not without confronting him first. He needed answers. He needed Marcus what he had done. But how? As Caleb returned to his desk after lunch, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, a text from his mother. "How are you holding up?" Caleb sighed, typing a quick response, trying to figure it out. He didn't have the heart to tell her how much worse he felt today than he had yesterday. Imani had been so worried when he left that morning, her eyes filled with the same fear she had tried to hide for years. She didn't want him getting caught up in Marcus's world. She didn't want him hurt the way she had been. But Caleb couldn't let it go. He couldn't walk away like nothing had happened. He needed to know why Marcus had done it, why he had fired her, blacklisted her, left them with nothing. And he needed Marcus to understand the consequences of his actions. The question was how to make that happen without losing everything in the process. As the afternoon dragged on, Caleb's frustration mounted. His work felt mechanical, every task just a distraction from the fury simmering beneath the surface. He kept his head down, but inside, his thoughts were racing. Finally, toward the end of the day, Caleb made up his mind. He couldn't keep stewing in silence. He had to confront Marcus face to face, no games. But he couldn't do it here, in the middle of the office, not where everyone could see, not where Marcus held all the power. Caleb stood up from his desk, his heart pounding. He needed a plan. He needed to catch Marcus off guard, in a setting where he wasn't in control. Somewhere outside the office, where Caleb could speak freely. As he packed up his things, an idea began to form. He had heard some of the senior staff talking about Marcus's dinner plans earlier in the day. Apparently, Marcus and his family often dined at a high-end restaurant not far from the office. A place where they could be seen, where Marcus could flaunt his success to the people who mattered. Caleb's jaw tightened. That would be his chance. He would go there, show up unannounced, and confront Marcus in front of the people he cared about most. He'd make him face the truth. Make him acknowledge what he had done to Imani. To Caleb. And he'd do it where Marcus couldn't hide behind his office door. The plan wasn't perfect, but it was something. It gave Caleb a sense of purpose, a way to channel the anger that had been eating at him for days. He couldn't wait any longer. He couldn't let Marcus keep living his lie. That evening, Caleb sat on the subway, the lights flickering above him as the train sped through the tunnels. His hands were clenched into fists in his lap, his mind set on what he was about to do. He was nervous, of course. He didn't know how Marcus would react, didn't know if this would blow up in his face, but he didn't care. He had to do it. He couldn't let Marcus get away with what he had done, not without facing the consequences. When he reached the restaurant, it was just as he had imagined, an upscale place with glass windows and soft lighting. The kind of place went to be seen. Caleb stood outside, watching the patrons inside. It didn't take long to spot Marcus. He was sitting at a table near the window, his wife Sterling beside him and their son Dorian across from them. They were laughing, enjoying their evening, completely unaware of the storm about to hit them. Caleb's heart raced as he stepped through the door, the noise of the restaurant fading into the background as he walked. Marcus didn't notice him at first. He was too busy talking to his wife, gesturing animatedly. But then, as Caleb drew closer, Marcus's eyes lifted and froze. The recognition was instant. Marcus's face tightened, his smile fading as he locked eyes with Caleb. For a brief moment, there was only silence, the tension thick in the air. Caleb stopped at the edge of the table, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. The moment everything would come crashing down. The restaurant buzzed with the quiet hum of conversation, silverware clinking against plates, glasses being raised in soft toasts. It was the kind of place where everything was polished, elegant, where people came to be seen but never heard too loudly. Caleb stood at the entrance, his heart racing, watching the man who had once been a distant mystery but was now so close he could almost reach out and touch him. Marcus Sterling sat at the corner table, his back to the window. His wife Sterling sat beside him, her perfectly styled hair catching the light from the chandeliers. Across from them was Dorian, looking every bit the part of a young man being groomed for success. They were laughing, unaware of the storm approaching. Caleb swallowed, his palms damp. This was it. He had planned for this moment, but now that he was here, doubt began creeping into the edges of his mind. His fingers twitched by his sides as he approached their table, each step feeling heavier than the last. Marcus looked up first. Their eyes locked across the space, and Caleb saw it instantly, the flicker of recognition, the tightening of Marcus's jaw. The easy smile that had been on Marcus's face a moment ago faded, replaced by something colder, something that couldn't be hidden. For a second, neither of them moved. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest, and Marcus's eyes hardened, his body tensing as though bracing for impact. Caleb reached the table, standing just a foot away, his presence casting a shadow over their perfect family dinner. "Caleb," Marcus said, his voice low, his eyes darting quickly to his wife and son before returning to Caleb. "What are you doing here?" Caleb felt his pulse quicken. Marcus's tone wasn't welcoming. It was defensive, controlled. He glanced at Sterling and Dorian, who were now staring at him with confusion. "I'm here for the same reason you are, Marcus," Caleb said, his voice steady but laced with tension. "Dinner." Sterling raised an eyebrow, turning toward her husband. "Marcus, is this someone from the office?" Marcus cleared his throat, his expression tight. "Yes, Caleb's a new employee." "A new employee?" Sterling repeated, her eyes shifting between Caleb and Marcus, sensing something was off. Dorian, sitting across the table, leaned forward, looking Caleb up and down. "Doesn't seem like a typical work meeting, Dad. What's going on?" Caleb clenched his fists at his sides, his chest tight with the weight of everything unsaid. He could feel Marcus's gaze burning into him, a silent plea to back down, to walk away. But Caleb had come too far to turn back now. "I'm not here about work," Caleb said, his voice firmer this time, directed squarely at Marcus. "I'm here about something else, something that happened a long time ago." Marcus's expression darkened, his shoulders squared. For the first time, Caleb saw something like fear flicker in his eyes. Sterling, sensing the shift, leaned closer to her husband, her brows furrowing. "Marcus," she asked quietly, "what is he talking about?" Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for his glass, his hand steady but his grip tighter than necessary. He took a slow sip of wine, his gaze never leaving Caleb. "This isn't the time or place for whatever this is, Caleb." But Caleb ignored him. His eyes darted to Sterling, then to Dorian, before settling back on Marcus. "I think it's exactly the time and place." There was a long pause, the kind that stretched too far, like the moment before a dam breaks. Caleb's voice lowered, filled with barely restrained anger. "You know who I am, don't you?" Marcus's jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with something Caleb couldn't quite place. Panic, perhaps, or maybe anger at being cornered. "Caleb," Marcus said quietly, trying to maintain control of the situation. "We can discuss this another time." "No," Caleb said, his voice rising slightly. "We talk about it now, in front of them." Dorian frowned, glancing at his father. "Dad, what's he talking about?" Sterling's hand touched Marcus's arm, concern etched in her face. "Marcus, what's going on? Why does he seem so angry?" Marcus's face was stony, his eyes locked on Caleb. But the tension in his posture gave him away. He didn't want this conversation to happen here. He didn't want the truth to come out. And that only fueled Caleb's resolve. Caleb took a breath, steadying himself. "I'm not just some new employee at your company," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "I'm the son you abandoned." Sterling's eyes widened, her hand freezing in place. "What?" Dorian's expression shifted from confusion to shock, his mouth slightly open as he looked from Caleb to his father. Marcus remained silent, his face pale but his jaw tight. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. Caleb took another step closer to the table, his voice shaking with barely controlled anger. 24 years ago, you fired my mother. You blacklisted her from the industry. You left her with nothing. And now I'm standing here, working for you, while you sit here pretending none of it ever happened. Sterling's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Marcus, is this true? Dorian's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing as he stared at his father. Dad, what is he talking about? Marcus remained silent, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Sterling's voice trembled as she looked at Marcus. You have another child? You did this to someone and never told me? Caleb felt the knot in his chest loosen just slightly as the truth finally began to break through the cracks in Marcus's carefully constructed life. He looked at Marcus, his anger giving way to something else, something almost like pity. You ruined her life, Caleb continued, his voice quieter now, more controlled. You left us with nothing, and you think you can just go on living like none of it ever happened? Marcus's face had drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time, Caleb saw him not as the powerful CEO he had always appeared to be, but as a man caught in the collapse of his own lies. Sterling's voice broke through the tension, barely above a whisper. Marcus, how could you? Marcus finally spoke, but his voice was hoarse, weak. I made a mistake. I didn't think. You didn't think it would come back to you, Caleb said, finishing the sentence for him. But it did. Dorian's face hardened even more, his eyes flashing with anger as he stared at his father. Dad, you seriously did this? You have a son you never told us about? Marcus's hand trembled as he set his glass down on the table, his eyes flicking between his family and Caleb, trapped in a moment he couldn't control. I thought it was over. I didn't want to hurt anyone. Caleb shook his head, bitterness creeping into his voice. It's never over, Marcus. You hurt my mother. You hurt me, and now you're going to have to face that. For a moment, no one spoke. The restaurant's quiet hum seemed to disappear, leaving only the heavy weight of truth hanging in the air. Sterling wiped her tears, her hand trembling as she placed it on the table in front of her. You've been lying to me. To us. For all these years. Marcus sat motionless, his face drained of color, staring at the glass of wine in front of him. His hands, once so steady, trembled slightly. He looked smaller now, as if the weight of his lies had finally pressed him down. Dorian leaned forward, his voice tight with anger. You have another son. You ruined someone's life and thought we'd never find out. Caleb stood at the edge of the table, his chest heaving with a mix of emotions, rage, hurt, and something like vindication. The truth was finally out in the open. And now Marcus couldn't hide behind his power or wealth. He couldn't pretend anymore. Marcus's eyes flickered to Caleb for a brief moment, then back to his wife and son. I didn't know how to tell you, he said weakly. I thought, if I buried it, it would go away. Sterling let out a bitter laugh, her voice breaking. Protect me? You didn't protect anyone, Marcus. You just protected yourself. Caleb's fists clenched by his sides. You thought you could just erase us. Pretend like we didn't exist. But we do, Marcus. We do. And we've been living with the consequences of your choices every single day. Marcus's eyes filled with something that almost resembled shame, but it was too little, too late. He had lived his life in comfort, building an empire, while Amani had struggled to raise Caleb alone. There was no excuse, no justification that could make up for that. Dorian's voice was full of disgust. You lied to us, Dad. You built this perfect image, but it's all a lie, isn't it? How many other secrets are there? How many other people have you hurt? Marcus shook his head desperately. There's no one else, I swear. Do you expect us to believe you? Sterling asked, her voice cracking again. After all this? Caleb looked at her, the pain raw in her eyes. He felt it too, but he had carried it longer, deeper. It was part of his DNA, part of every struggle he and his mother had faced. You're not the only one he hurt, Caleb said quietly, his voice filled with cold anger. My mother, Imani. She tried to get back on her feet after Marcus fired her. She tried to find work, but everywhere she went, she was shut out. He blacklisted her. He ruined her reputation. We struggled for years while he sat here living like nothing had happened. Sterling's face crumpled as the full weight of Caleb's words sank in. She turned to Marcus, her voice barely above a whisper. You did that to her? You ruined her life just to protect your own? Marcus's hands trembled as he set his glass down on the table, his eyes filled with guilt and regret. I didn't know what else to do, he said weakly. I was scared. Scared? Dorian spat, his voice rising. That's your excuse? Caleb felt the rage bubbling up again, but this time it wasn't just for himself. It was for his mother, for all the years she had sacrificed, all the pain she had endured alone. You don't get to be scared, Caleb said, his voice trembling with anger. You didn't lose everything. We did. Marcus looked up at Caleb, his eyes filled with something hollow, something broken. I'm sorry, he whispered. But Caleb wasn't interested in apologies. Not now. Not after everything. Sorry doesn't change anything, Caleb said coldly. It doesn't fix what you did. You don't get to say sorry and walk away. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but Sterling cut him off, her voice shaking with anger. Caleb's right. You don't get to fix this with an apology, Marcus. You lied to us. You destroyed lives. She turned to Caleb, her expression softening as fresh tears welled up in her eyes. I'm so sorry, Caleb. I didn't know. I didn't know any of this. Caleb looked at her, his anger still simmering but tempered now by a strange sense of clarity. He nodded. I know. This isn't your fault. Dorian, who had been silent for a moment, spoke again, his voice filled with disbelief. So what now? What are we supposed to do with this, Dad? Pretend like nothing happened? Marcus didn't respond. He looked down at the table, his hands shaking, his face pale. The man who had once seemed so powerful, so untouchable, was now reduced to a shell of the person he had pretended to be. We can't pretend anymore, Sterling said quietly, her voice filled with pain. We have to face this. Caleb's chest tightened as he watched Marcus, this man who had caused so much damage, sitting there in silence, unable to answer for his actions. The truth had finally come out, and now the family he had built on lies was crumbling around him. I've said what I needed to say, Caleb said, his voice steady but cold. Now it's up to you to decide how to deal with it. Sterling's tears fell freely now, and even Dorian, who had been filled with anger moments ago, looked lost. The weight of Marcus's betrayal had shattered their family, and there was no going back. Marcus finally looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll fix this. I'll make it right. But Caleb shook his head. You can't fix this, Marcus. You can't undo what you've done. With that, he turned away from the table, leaving them to grapple with the truth. As he walked out of the restaurant, the weight on his chest loosened just a little. The confrontation was over. The truth had finally been laid bare. But the damage had been done, and there was no turning back. The buzz around the office at Sterling Associates was different the next day. Conversations that were usually light and professional had a sharp edge of gossip. Eyes darted toward Marcus' Sterling office, the glass walls seemingly more transparent than ever, as though everyone inside the building could see the cracks forming around the man who had built an empire. Caleb sat at his desk, watching the movements of the people around him. The news had spread faster than he expected, and now the whispers had turned into open discussions. Everyone knew. Marcus Sterling, the untouchable CEO, was no longer invincible. Caleb stared at the report in front of him, the words a blur. He should have felt some sense of satisfaction, knowing that the man who had ruined his mother's life was finally facing the consequences of his actions. But instead, there was a quiet emptiness that settled inside him. The anger that had driven him to confront Marcus was no longer burning as fiercely. Now there was just the fallout. His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts, a text from his mother. How are you? Caleb sighed, typing a quick response. It's all over the office now. Everyone knows. Her reply came almost instantly. Are you okay? He hesitated before responding. I think so. Just trying to figure out what comes next. Caleb leaned back in his chair, glancing toward the far end of the office where Marcus's door remained closed. No one had seen him come in today, and rumors were already swirling. Some said he was hiding out at home, avoiding the public eye. Others speculated he was meeting with lawyers. trying to protect himself from the storm that was brewing. It didn't matter. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. By noon, Caleb's phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't a text from his mother. It was a company-wide email. The subject line was simple: company announcement. Caleb's heart raced as he clicked it open. Dear team, effective immediately, Marcus Sterling has stepped down from his role as CEO of Sterling Associates. The board of directors has appointed an interim CEO while the company transitions through this period. We remain committed to our values and will continue to uphold the integrity and reputation of the company. Thank you for your continued dedication during this time. Caleb's hand tightened around his phone. It was done. Marcus was out. For a moment he just sat there, staring at the email, letting the words sink in. The man who had wielded so much power, who had made decisions that destroyed lives without a second thought, had finally lost his seat at the top. But it wasn't the victory Caleb had imagined. He had pictured this moment so many times, Marcus's downfall, his public humiliation. But now that it was real, it didn't feel the way Caleb thought it would. There was no rush of triumph, no sense of closure. It just felt hollow. His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. Another text from his mother. I just saw the news. Are you okay with this? He stared at the message for a long moment before replying. Yeah, he's done. But it doesn't feel like I thought it would. Her response came slower this time, more careful. It won't feel like you expected, Caleb. But you did what you had to. That's what matters. Caleb closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words wash over him. She was right. He had done what he needed to do. The truth was out, and Marcus was gone. But the cost of it all still weighed heavy on his chest. Later that afternoon, the whispers in the office had turned into full-blown discussions. Caleb kept his head down, avoiding the curious glances that some of his colleagues threw his way. He didn't want to be part of the gossip. He didn't want to be the center of attention. He just wanted to get through the day. But as the hours dragged on, Caleb knew he couldn't avoid it forever. At some point, he'd have to face the reality of what had happened, not just to Marcus, but to himself. He had spent so long building up to that moment of confrontation, so long imagining what it would feel like to finally make Marcus Sterling pay for what he had done. But now that it was over, Caleb was left with the fallout. He was still working at the company Marcus had built. The company that had, in part, been built on lies. A knock on his desk pulled him from his thoughts. Caleb looked up to see his supervisor, Miss Vaughn, standing there, her face unreadable. Can we talk for a minute? She asked, her voice calm but serious. Caleb nodded, following her to a quiet conference room at the back of the office. The room was small, with glass walls that offered a view of the bustling floor outside. Miss Vaughn closed the door behind them, folding her arms across her chest as she leaned against the table. So, she began, her tone measured. I'm sure you've seen the news. Caleb nodded, unsure where this conversation was going. Yeah. She watched him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. I know about your connection to Marcus. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected that. You do? Miss Vaughn nodded slowly. Word gets around. I don't know all the details, but people are talking. Caleb felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the fear of being exposed creeping in. What exactly are they saying? She sighed, running a hand through her hair. Mostly that you're his son, that the confrontation at the restaurant wasn't exactly private. Caleb's stomach dropped. He hadn't thought about that. The restaurant had been busy, filled with people who were probably just as interested in the gossip as they were in their meals. Of course, word would spread. I didn't mean for this to happen, Caleb said, his voice low. I needed to confront him for what he did. Miss Vaughn nodded, her expression softening. I get it. I don't blame you. But you need to be careful, Caleb. This company is going through a rough time right now. With Marcus stepping down, there's going to be a lot of scrutiny. People will be watching you. Caleb swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. What do you mean? I mean, she said quietly, you need to decide what you want to do. Staying here, working at the company your father built. It's going to come with challenges. People are going to ask questions. They're going to want answers. Caleb stared at her, his mind racing. He hadn't thought about that. He had been so focused on confronting Marcus, on making him face the truth, that he hadn't considered the aftermath. Working here, staying in the shadow of his father's legacy, it wasn't just about the job anymore. You don't have to decide right now, miss, Vaughn added, her voice softer now. But think about it. This place is changing, and you need to figure out if you want to be a part of that change. Caleb nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. Thanks, he said quietly. I'll think about it. Miss Vaughn gave him a small nod before stepping out of the room, leaving Caleb alone with his thoughts. By the time Caleb left the office that evening, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city streets. He walked slowly, his mind heavy with everything that had happened. Marcus was gone. He had stepped down, forced out by the truth Caleb had exposed. But now Caleb was left with a choice. Could he stay at Sterling Associates, knowing the history that lay behind the company's success? Or was it time to move on, to leave the shadow of his father behind and find a new path? He didn't have an answer yet. All he knew was that the truth had changed everything, and now he had to figure out where he stood in the aftermath. As he reached his apartment, Caleb's phone buzzed again, another text from his mother. Come home. We'll figure this out together. Caleb smiled faintly, the weight on his chest lifting just a little. He had confronted the past. Now it was time to decide what kind of future he wanted to build. Caleb sat at the kitchen table, the familiar warmth of his mother's apartment surrounding him. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the soft hum of the radio in the background. It was a quiet, peaceful moment, but the weight of the past few days still lingered in the room. Imani was at the stove, her back turned to him as she stirred a pot of oatmeal. She hadn't said much since he had walked through the door the night before, and Caleb knew she was waiting for him to tell her what had happened, waiting for him to say what he planned to do next. He hadn't figured that out yet. But at least here, in this small, familiar space, the world didn't seem as heavy. Imani set the pot aside and turned to face him, wiping her hands on a dish towel. You want to talk about it? Caleb looked up at her, the weariness in his bones too heavy to hide. He set his coffee down. Marcus is gone, he said simply. The company's already announced it. Imani's eyes softened as she sat down across from him. I heard. It's all over the news. They're calling it a scandal. Caleb nodded, rubbing his hands together as he tried to find the words. It doesn't feel like I thought it would, Mom, I thought. I don't know. I thought I'd feel something more. Relief, maybe. Satisfaction. But I don't. Imani reached across the table and placed a hand on his. That's because this isn't just about him. It's about everything we went through. And nothing he does now can undo what happened. Caleb looked down at her hand, the lines of wear and resilience etched into her skin. She had been through so much, carried so much weight for so many years. And now, even with Marcus out of the picture, the scars remained. I don't know what to do next, Caleb admitted, his voice quiet. Staying at the company feels wrong, but leaving, I don't know if that's the answer either. Imani nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. You don't have to decide everything right now, Caleb. You've already done the hardest part. You faced him. You made him own up to what he did. Caleb let out a shaky breath, the memories of that confrontation still fresh in his mind. I just keep thinking about all those years, all the times I asked about my father and you couldn't tell me the truth, and now that I know, it feels like it wasn't worth it. Imani's expression softened, and she leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. It was worth it, Caleb. You deserved to know the truth, and no matter how painful it was, you needed to hear it. Caleb stared at her, the depth of her words sinking in. She was right. Even though the truth had shattered the image of the father he had imagined, it was still his truth. And now, with everything laid bare, he could finally start to move forward. I just don't know where to go from here, Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. Imani's hand tightened around his. You're strong, Caleb. Stronger than you know. You've been through it all and you've come out the other side. And now you get to decide what happens next. You get to build the life you want, without anyone holding you back. Caleb met her eyes, and for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. You're right, he said softly. I can move on from this. Imani smiled, a small, tired smile, but one that held a world of strength. We both can. The day passed slowly, but it was filled with small moments of comfort. Caleb stayed with his mother, helping around the apartment, cooking dinner together, sharing stories about anything but Marcus Sterling. For the first time in what felt like forever, they allowed themselves to enjoy the simplicity of being together without the weight of the past hanging over them. Later that evening, as they sat on the couch watching a rerun of an old sitcom, Caleb turned to Imani, the question that had been on his mind all day finally pushing its way to the surface. Do you think we'll ever get real justice for what he did? Caleb asked quietly. Imani's gaze remained fixed on the television, her face thoughtful. We already have, in a way. Caleb frowned, confused. What do you mean? She turned to him, her expression calm but resolute. Justice isn't always about punishment, Caleb. Sometimes it's about survival. Marcus may have destroyed my career, but he didn't destroy me. I raised you. We survived. And now we're stronger than we ever would have been if he'd stayed in our lives. Caleb stared at her, the depth of her words sinking in. She was right. They had survived, despite everything Marcus had done, despite the obstacles he had thrown in their way. They had built a life. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't always been fair, but they had made it through. Justice isn't just about seeing him fall. Imani continued, her voice steady. It's about us standing tall, and we're still standing. Caleb felt a lump rise in his throat, the emotions swirling inside him too complex to put into words. He had spent so long focused on the idea of bringing Marcus down, of making him pay for what he had done. But now, sitting here with his mother, he realized that the real victory was in the fact that they had made it this far despite everything. I guess you're right, Caleb said softly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. We're still here. Imani squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with pride. And we always will be. The following morning, Caleb woke up to the sound of birds outside the window and the smell of pancakes drifting from the kitchen. For a brief moment, he lay there, letting himself enjoy the peace, the normalcy. No Marcus Sterling, no looming confrontation. Just him and his mother, the way it had always been. He got up, pulling on a hoodie and sweatpants, and made his way to the kitchen where Imani stood flipping pancakes, a soft smile on her face. Morning, sleepyhead, she said, teasing. Caleb chuckled, rubbing his eyes. Morning. They sat down together, eating in comfortable silence. Every so often, Imani would glance at him, as if checking to see if he was really okay. Caleb appreciated it more than he could say. When they finished eating, Imani set her fork down and leaned back in her chair. So, she said, her tone gentle but firm, what are you thinking? Caleb pushed his empty plate away and rested his elbows on the table, lacing his fingers together. I'm thinking. He started slowly. I can't stay at Sterling Associates. Imani nodded, as if she had been expecting that. I've been thinking about everything you said, Caleb continued, about survival, about standing tall. I don't want my future tied to his past. I need to make my own way. Imani reached across the table, squeezing his hand. I'm proud of you, she said simply. Caleb smiled, feeling the weight in his chest ease just a little more. But I also want to do something, he added, his voice growing more certain. Not for revenge, for the people like us, for the people who don't get justice. Imani tilted her head, curious. What are you thinking? Caleb leaned forward, his voice filled with new determination. I want to start something, a foundation, something that helps people who get shut out, like you were. People who lose their jobs unfairly, who get blacklisted, discriminated against. I want to give them a fighting chance. Imani's eyes widened, and then she smiled, the kind of smile that reached all the way to her eyes. You really are my son, she said, laughing softly. Caleb grinned. Guess so. The idea had taken root in his mind the moment he realized that bringing Marcus Sterling down wasn't enough. Real justice, lasting change, meant building something better in its place. They spent the rest of the morning sketching out ideas, what the foundation would look like, who it would help, how it could grow. Caleb felt a sense of excitement he hadn't felt in days, maybe even weeks. For the first time in a long time, He wasn't reacting to Marcus's choices. He was making his own. Later that afternoon, Caleb sat at the small desk in his bedroom, the sunlight spilling across the notepad in front of him. He scribbled ideas, crossed out others, building a vision piece by piece. A knock at his door broke his focus. "Come in," he called. Imani stepped inside, holding a small box in her hands. "I found something," she said, her voice a little shaky. Caleb turned in his chair as she crossed the room and handed him the box. It was old, the corners worn. He opened it carefully, and inside were photos, pictures he had never seen before. Pictures of his mother when she was younger, smiling brightly, full of hope. And among them, tucked at the bottom, was a photo that made his breath catch in his throat. It was his mother and Marcus, standing together, younger, laughing. Before everything had fallen apart, Caleb stared at the photo, his chest tightening. "I kept it," Imani said quietly, sitting on the edge of his bed. "Not because I wanted to remember him, but because I wanted to remember that once, even for a moment, there was a time when things were good." Caleb nodded slowly, understanding. "You can't erase the past," Imani said, "but you can choose what you carry with you into the future." Caleb placed the photo back in the box, closing the lid gently. "I'm choosing us," he said. "Our future." Imani smiled through her tears. "And I'll be with you every step of the way." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long golden beams across the room, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would still be challenges, still be shadows to fight against. But he wasn't afraid. He had survived the worst. He had faced the truth. And now, with his mother by his side and a new dream in his heart, he was ready to build something better. Something stronger. Something that would stand tall, long after the shadows had faded. Because survival was justice. And their story wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning.